So today's talk is about courage. That's the word of the day. And it should have been a really easy talk to do. In fact, I can do it in 15 seconds. I have really good anecdotes. It could be my daughter jumping off the 10-meter diving board. I don't know if you've ever been to the 10-meter diving board and looked down. I can't even imagine jumping off it, never mind being crazy enough to dive off it. It could be about my rugby teacher who said, "Boys, I can give you skills, you're a team, I can't give you courage, you're on your own there." That was just before we played in the semi-final of some cup against this team who are well known for being much bigger than us. If you've ever tried to tackle somebody much bigger than you, you'll know what it's like. It could be about the screw tape letters which C.S. Lewis wrote, where he says, the devil says to the other devil, courage is the one virtue that we've failed to manage to corrupt in the eyes of the world. It's kind of the solid one. Or it could be about the books that I've been reading this summer, this very entertaining kind of book with this, it's a fantasy book, so it's got a dude with a sword, and he's got this phrase he keeps saying, which is, well, I suppose it's better to face it than live with the fear. And then off he goes and does something courageous and so on. And then the Bible is also totally full of courageous people. There's Stephen, who overcame his fear of death. He didn't run away when he was about to be stoned. He just took it. There was Daniel, who I tried to pick names of people who we know. There's Daniel, who didn't seem to mind being in the lion's den or faced the lions. There was Paul, who he knew he was going to go to prison for some of this stuff, but he didn't run away. He kept on going. There was even the Pharisees, actually, who were quite fearful. They had so much fear of being rejected, not having their social status, not being kind of the big cheese, that they often wouldn't go do what they probably knew was right, actually, or probably thought was, hey, that's a neat idea, but they didn't do it because they were too scared of losing their position. And then there was a whole raft of people who Jesus interacted with who were, courageous. The woman at the well who probably was pretty scared to talk to some random Jewish guy who was probably quite famous and walked along, or the woman in adultery, or any number of people who plucked up the courage to reach out and touch a cloak or touch something to be healed. So there you go. A quick set of examples. Off you go. Take those examples, follow them. You'll be good. Put on the Sunday roast. We're done. We can have the post-sermon hymn. No, you can't. Because if you look up the word of courage in the Bible, you'll find actually it doesn't appear very much. It's more characterized as be not afraid, do not fear, I am with you. And even if you look it up in the dictionary, actually courage is characterized in relation to fear. So it's characterized as the mental or moral strength to venture, to persevere, to withstand danger, fear, or difficulty. That's one definition. And another one was the ability to control your fear in dangerous or difficult situations. So it's actually quite hard to put your finger on, well, what is courage, really? Because the dictionary doesn't manage it, and apparently the Bible talks more about don't fear than it talks about being courageous. And so it turns around pretty quick, well, what if we don't persevere or venture out or withstand danger, fear and difficulty? What if we can't control our fear in dangerous situations and we kind of react to what's around us rather than thinking it through? When I go back to my first examples, Stephen becomes a quiet guy around town, and Daniel kind of converts quietly to paganism and dies as a bit of an admin for Nebuchadnezzar. Paul kind of gives up when he goes to prison, so Philemon doesn't really happen, and all sorts of things don't happen. Or maybe he even decides that preaching in Rome is a bit too hot to handle, really, with all these risks of going to prison and so on. And the Pharisees, maybe they realise that they don't know everything, that there are more important things than having your tassels the right length and seating at the top table, and they change how they do spiritual leadership. And in short, if they hadn't been governed by their fears, the Bible would have been quite a different book, and the story of God's people would be quite different. And I picked 5 examples, but you could pick 500 more probably. So it's worth looking a bit at fear, was what I realised, because you can then place courage in the context of fear. There are apparently, if one checks up a bit, there are 5 groupings of fears, and I kind of like this sort of thing because it helps place things in context and helps give a bit of a bigger picture. And apparently these five fears, they can apply to individuals, they can apply to groups of people, to churches, to companies, to whatever. And the first one is fear of extinction, which would have been Stephen's fear, I guess. It's the fear of standing on the edge of a high building. It's the fear of ceasing to exist, the fear of death, I guess, or maybe even more than that. The second is the fear of, this is a bit gruesome, I'm sorry, but it's labelled as the fear of mutilation. So the fear of losing some of your body, of an arm, or having your body's boundaries invaded. So losing its natural functions and ability to do stuff. And I'm not sure I quite see this, but apparently the fear of snakes and spiders and creepy things, that's the fear it's driving at, is that fear. The third one is loss of autonomy, which I guess would be Paul's fear. So this fear of being entrapped, imprisoned, really being controlled by circumstances beyond our control, losing our chance to be who we are, make our own choices. Claustrophobia comes from that, but also it really applies to social interactions and to relationships and so on. The next is separation, the fear of, so I guess Paul would have been a fear of loss of autonomy. If he'd have let that govern him, that would have been, not going to prison and so on. Separation is another, the fear of abandonment or rejection or losing the connectedness, being a non-person, not wanted, not valued by other folks. So that, to a certain extent, the Pharisees might have been in this position that they were fearful of being separated from all their structures, from being rejected by those whose approval they sought. And then the final one of this feararchy, that's what it's labelled as, a feararchy of fears, is ego death. So this is kind of the public speaking fear, when you stand up at the lectern and think, what am I going to say? And the shame and the embarrassment and the humiliation, that feeling of being worthless and not capable and just useless, and obviously driven by being mocked, being laughed at, being made to be insecure. And it feels to me like lots of the people who interacted with Jesus, they were overcoming that fear. They were overcoming that fear of being laughed or mocked at, because presumably when they went before to have that sort of interaction with people, they were humiliated, maybe not just even told go away, but kind of really people turn the knife. So this feararchy of kind of a growing depth and complexity of fears, it sort of sits behind the need for courage to a certain extent. And then there's the fear of fear itself. I think it was Roosevelt who said, we have nothing to fear but fear itself. Actually, it turns out there's some truth in that, because for all of these fears, we all have responses that were created probably a long time ago in response to those fears, and they call it micro-fear, that it comes out as a response, like a micro-response to a perceived fear, and it might not be real, it might not be there anymore, but that kind of responsiveness is still there, because you're still fearing the fear, even if that's passed away so long before, because it's rooted and it's grounded in history, even if we're overcome. And it feels that understanding this and getting to the bottom of this is super important, because these fears, they drive, if they're not careful, they can, if we're not courageous, essentially they can drive who we are. They can drive what choices we make. They can drive bad choices, actually, if you choose things out of fear and out of some of those not pleasant things that are governed by fear. Fear is the root of most angers. It's, if you drill down far enough, it's some fear that's at the bottom of there. And many sins are also rooted in that fear, even things like jealousy. Well, it's fear that he's getting ahead of me, I'm not going to be rejected, I'm not in the right place. Or envy is All of them, you can come back and say, what real fear does that get pinned to? Not only for an individual, but for churches facing extinction. If you're not careful, you can do the wrong thing out of fear. So I started, well, what about where are the examples of Jesus for this? And well, then I realised, well, on the extinction part, the very first words of John's Gospel are set to remind us that God is eternal, that Jesus is eternal. In the beginning was the Word, not right now, not, well, it's all going to pass away in 20 years, but in the beginning. And in my Father's house are many rooms. And even the resurrection itself, extinction is not a fear that we have to fear if we follow Christ. For the mutilation, and well, there's Daniel in his lion's den, of course, but how many times did Jesus heal by saying, what you have, what's wrong with your body, that's not an impediment to worship God. It's not an impediment to following me, to being a Christian. That he would make that point over and over again. On autonomy, of course, there's a church and community and pastoral care to make sure that there's those social interactions are there and that people aren't in prison. That's why we're trying to live stream, I guess, to a certain extent to avoid that. But there's also, Jesus didn't fear putting himself in the hands of the Romans, and where he kind of lost control to a certain extent, in so much as God can never lose control, but he gave up control. He carried his own cross up to the crucifixion. For separation, it's said that we can be children of God, and how many times did Jesus reach out to the people who were separated, who were rejected, who weren't wanted by anyone else? As Dorothy preached a couple of weeks ago, he went after the one sheep, not the 99. He was prepared to go that extra mile. And finally, for the humiliation and shame, there is forgiveness, and there's the cross, where he himself was, people tried to humiliate him and mock him when he was hanging there on the cross. So it feels that all through the gospel there runs this path of actually the courage of Jesus as he overcame these fears, as he understood what they were, as he understood what they were doing to him, and behaved appropriately. And that brings us to today's gospel. So Jesus starts out with this really provocative statement of you have to, if you don't hate your brother, sister, wife, mother, father, whoever, then you can't follow me. And truly, I've never really understood that, because it seems directly in contravention to love your neighbour as yourself and love God. And there are a couple of conventional explanations which also actually didn't make much sense to me, but I bring them forward anyway. One of which is, well, you have to love Jesus so much that your love of brother, sister, wife, etc. feels like hate, because it's so much less than your love for Jesus. And I'm not kind of sure that makes sense. It's a bit like saying to a kid, well, you've only got so much love to go around, so you've got 80% today, you've got 20%. Well, that's not how love works. It's not how that works. The other one is, well, if they're not Christians, it's kind of okay, really, because they're not behaving as they should. So there's going to be conflict, of course, if you're a Christian and they're not. Well, that doesn't seem to make much sense as well. So, but then I think through, well, what does it mean in the context of the fears? And I think it means that what you have to be prepared for, that if you do want to be a disciple, if you do want to take up the cross and follow, that it will change all those relationships, that there will be discussions, there will be tensions, there will be maybe you are being controlled and you don't want to be controlled anymore. Maybe you stand up for not being humiliated or abused. Maybe you just want to get out more. Maybe there's 100 things that would change when you stop being governed by fear because you're being courageous. So all the fears that are in those relationships, because we're all human and these are human relationships, can be, as you start to overcome them, that can change things. And I think that's more what it's driving at, rather than saying you actually have to hate someone, which doesn't feel very godly. And then the second bit's about, if you're going to build a tower, you should kind of figure out whether you've got enough bricks before you start. And if you're going to go to war, then maybe you should count the number of troops before you get there. Conquer our fears. It's more than being crazy. It's more than being just the hero dashing in one person against 10,000. Essentially what it's saying is turn your fears into knowledge, so you can actually make right decisions, not make decisions that are rooted in the wrong thing. And even Jesus himself, when he was, he don't cast yourself, I'm not going to throw myself off the temple, and be courageous and throw myself off the temple just because you said it's a great idea, and then wait for God to catch me. That's not how God works. He's not giving cheapness he's not giving courage cheaply. He's saying courage is overcoming your fear so you can make decisions with me. And of course that doesn't necessarily mean that charging into 10,000 people is a good idea. If I thought I'd throw in an NFL reference just for Walter, that Aaron Rodgers doesn't try the Hail Mary every single time, even though it might be, quotes, courageous to go for the big play. He does it actually when he's got no choice, and he does it, I'm sure, when the stats say that's the best chance he's got of winning the game. So he's got fear of losing, but he doesn't let it dominate his thinking. His thinking is rational, it's logical, it's looking at the whole picture and trying to figure things out. It's not just reacting in the moment. And it's not courageous to throw ourselves away or to march to death when there are other choices. It's not courageous to do the Hail Mary when it's really not the right play to make. And also conquering our own fear and us changing and us following Jesus doesn't guarantee that other people are going to change either. They're not in the same position. It's a different position. All it changes is our ability to have knowledge of what's going on, to understand ourselves, to understand why we're reacting in that way, to respond accordingly and in accordance with being Christians. How do we do that? That, unfortunately, I don't quite know. It feels like it's a lifelong battle. It feels like prayer is good. I've spoken before about this book that claims that at the end of, not at the end, but as you pray more and more, it becomes like the emotions are like clouds rushing around mountains, so they don't actually affect you. You can see they're there. You can figure how it is. You can figure what's the right thing to do, but you're not being driven by them in the same way. But I think it's just that battle of prayer, of asking for help, of self-understanding, of offering ourselves to God. So maybe it's right that this morning, although I wanted I wanted the upbeatness, but that's not the way it seems to have gone. And maybe that's what's happened here as well. I wanted to talk about courage and the heroism of Jonah and his bravery and all that malarkey. And actually it's turned into a sermon about fears and what the deep fears are that drive at us, and how to be courageous doesn't mean to dash in with the sword out of there, but to understand that the fears come out of a vacuum, don't come out of a vacuum, they come out of our lives, our environments, our interactions forever. And to be courageous often means to name those fears, to control your fear in the face of what's out there, to turn it into knowledge and understanding and of how to be with others. So it doesn't give us the carte blanche to be reckless and blindly rely on God. It doesn't give us the chance to change others or the world in one magic swipe, alas. Others have fears too. It's not just us that has this. It's the reason those 5 are useful buckets is because they're universal to humans pretty much. And it doesn't mean that the decisions that follow from being courageous and facing fears are easy. What it does do, though, is it lets them be based on love for God, of love for others, of love for self, of the love that drives out fear, not the love not the fear that drives out love. And as today's gospel says, it's to get to the point where you understand the decision and make the right choice, not do the crazy things. And in the end, Jesus says so many times, or the Bible says so many times, do not be afraid, which I think is a reminder of all Jesus did to calm fears, or God did to calm the fears of the people of Israel, and to help people overcome their fear and sometimes the real rejection of the society they lived in, so that they could live with God. And he still says, be not afraid today, and fear is that kind of projecting forward what it might be that's wrong, but he says, be of hope, be of good heart, be courageous and face that. Don't live with it, face it, and be with him, and be not afraid. And that is where I finish today. So go out, be courageous, but don't go charging any mountains with 10,000 people on them with a sword. Rather be courageous by facing fears and understanding what's driving some of the fears that sit behind. Amen.
Amen.